Only a year or so ago, Argentina's President Javier Milei was riding high. The austere reforms he implemented early in his term had indeed triggered a recession, but by early 2025, it looked like the Argentinian economy was bouncing back. Year-on-year GDP growth peaked at an astonishing 7.8% in April. Month-on-month inflation fell to a post-pandemic low of 1.5% in May, and Milei's approval ratings were sky high. However, in the past couple of months, things have quietly gone into reverse. Growth has stagnated, inflation has ticked back up, and the head of Argentina's Statistical Institute quit last week after Milei refused to let him update the institute's methodology for calculating inflation, which would have given a more accurate but higher reading. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at the Argentinian economy and why things don't look so rosy for Milei right now. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. So there are basically two bits of data that don't bode well for Milei. The first is the latest inflation data. As you might already know, one of Milei's big policy objectives since he took office has been to bring down inflation, which has been a chronic problem in the Argentinian economy. For context, year-on-year inflation in Argentina averaged about 50% between 2019 and 2022, and rose steadily throughout 2023 to a high of over 200% that December, which is when Milei won election. Milei's plan to reduce inflation involved doing two things: tightening fiscal and monetary policy, and a sudden 50% devaluation of the peso. In making imports way more expensive, this sudden devaluation was always going to lead to some inflation in the short term. But Milei was hoping that, in the longer term, it would stabilise the peso, and thus prevent further inflation-inducing devaluations. Originally, it looked like this plan was working. Month-on-month inflation fell from a high of 25% in December 2023 to just 1.5% in May 2025, an 8-year low if you exclude the first couple of months of the pandemic. Now, it's important not to overstate this, and Argentina was far from a haven of price stability. After all, a 1.5% monthly inflation rate still translates to an annual inflation rate of about 20%, which would be considered dangerously high in basically any other country. Nonetheless, by Argentinian standards, it was pretty great, and Milei touted the falling inflation rate as proof that, painful as they might have been, his austere reforms were working, bringing some much-needed stability to the Argentinian economy. Unfortunately for Milei, however, month-on-month inflation has since ticked up, reaching a new peak of 2.9% in January, which would translate to an annual rate of over 40%. Moreover, there are reasons to think this number is actually an underestimate. This is because the methodology that Argentina's Statistical Authority currently uses to calculate inflation is based on an outdated household spending survey from 2004. Obviously, how Argentine households spend their money has changed a bit in the past 2 decades. Specifically, they spend more money on services, and Argentina's Statistical Authority was therefore planning on updating its methodology to reflect this at the beginning of the year. However, because this new methodology would have produced a higher reading, Milei and his ministers essentially told the Statistical Authority, which is supposed to be independent, that they weren't allowed to change the methodology until, quote, the process of disinflation has been consolidated, while refusing to provide a more specific timeline. This amounted to a pretty blatant case of political interference in the nominally independent process of data collection, and the head of the Statistical Authority resigned in protest on Monday. Anyway, you get the idea. The disinflation we saw earlier in Milei's term has reversed, and the recent fiasco with the Statistical Authority suggests things are even worse than the headline numbers suggest. On to the second bit of unflattering data, Argentina's GDP figures. Last year, Milei talked a lot about a V-shaped recovery, essentially claiming that, while his so-called shock therapy might temporarily push Argentina into recession, the Argentinian economy would quickly bounce back, and its newfound stability would give way to stronger growth than ever. Again, originally it looked like things were on track, but unfortunately for Milei, the most recent data suggests this recovery is already stalling. You can see this by looking at monthly GDP figures. Milei's austerity triggered a sharp recession in early 2024, before an impressive rebound in the second half of the year. However, the latest data suggests Argentina's economy has barely grown since May, and actually shrank in October and November, the latest month for which data is available. This persistently weak growth throughout the second half of 2025 has offset the stronger growth we saw at the start of the year, and Argentina's GDP was down 0.3% year-on-year in November. Furthermore, these headline GDP figures have been buttressed by strong growth in Argentina's mining industry, which experienced an astonishing 30% year-on-year growth in exports in 2025. But Milei can't really take any credit for this. As you can see by just looking at the numbers, the boom started after the pandemic and has been mostly driven by rising global demand for certain precious metals, especially gold, which usually accounts for about 70% of mining exports. As you might already know, gold prices have surged over the past couple of years, and this has obviously been great news for Argentinian gold miners. As well as gold, Argentina also has relatively large reserves of silver, which also experienced a price surge in the past couple of years. Lithium, which has emerged as a key component in certain green technologies including batteries, and copper, where demand is expected to far outstrip supply in the coming years, given how much copper we're all going to need for the energy transition and, more specifically, electrification. Argentina is also enjoying somewhat of an oil and gas boom, thanks to increases in output at the Vaca Muerta field. Again though, Milei can't really take credit for any of this, and it leaves the economy dangerously reliant on global commodity prices. His supporters might argue that his pro-market reforms should add fuel to the fire and attract big multinationals into Argentina, but while a handful of big mining companies like Rio Tinto and Glencore have recently announced plans to invest in Argentina, a number of others, including Exxon, Petronas and Total, have taken advantage of Milei's reforms to sell their Argentinian assets at a fair price. This has happened in other parts of the economy, which is why, last year, net foreign investment went negative for the first time since 2003. This isn't Milei's fault. These companies are leaving because Argentina has a history of instability that long predates him. More generally, many of the issues we're currently seeing in the Argentinian economy reflect anxieties about the stability of its politics, rather than Milei's policies. Nonetheless, even if you think Milei's policies will ultimately pay off, it does look like he at least overpromised, and this leaves him in somewhat of a political pickle.
As is so often the case these days, a lot of how this plays out depends on influence. Not only who technically has the power to make things happen, but also who has the sway to make sure it does. That's why last year we put together a list of the world's 25 most influential people, using rankings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. This year we've done the same, producing a brand new ranking for 2026. In the upcoming issue of our magazine Too Long, we explore our list, telling the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We look to the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastions of technocracy like Prime Minister Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. As always, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just our most influential people ranking though. We also have a whole featured segment on how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being used by politicians around the world, and much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, or to get the best deal, you can just subscribe to the magazine. Doing so gets you 20% off every copy for the lifetime of your subscription, and if you use code SPRING26, you'll get an additional £3 off your first copy, bringing the price as low as £4.99. Find out more and order your copy today at toolong.news.